Good evening all, and welcome. Just a quick announcement. Due to popular demand and the fact that many of you in the comments section have requested this, I have extended the Patreon promotion for a little bit longer. If you're interested in receiving some or all of these rewards, you can sign up on Patreon to get them. They're pretty cool and it'd be great to have you. So all that you need to do is go down in the description, click the link at the very top of it, and it'll tell you everything you need to do. Of course, this is entirely optional, but it does help me out an awful lot and is extremely appreciated. But anyway, without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was approximately 3 years old, I had two experiences that at the time I did not quite understand. The first time I thought nothing of it, even though it seemed to surprise my family. But as I'd gotten older, I had become increasingly interested in all things supernatural and anything related to it. My first experience is more memorable. Like many young kids, I would talk to someone while playing alone. My parents had passed it off as an imaginary friend and entertained the idea when I could talk about it. Whenever they would mention that my friend was imaginary, I would become upset and protest, saying the guy was real. For about 2 months, I would have a sort of routine that I would go through daily. Just a disclaimer, the explanation I'm about to write is both from memory and what my parents remember me telling them. My mum also decided to record me one day while playing with my friend, and also asked me to explain him in the video. All of what I'm about to explain was obviously not seen by my parents, because I believe it was something supernatural, and that only I could see him. So, I would sit on the couch staring out the front window of the house until an old orange pickup truck would pull into our driveway. A fat man with a dog would get out of the truck and come inside. The man's name was John, and the dog's name was Lucky Duck. We would go into our living room and play for a while, and then when he had to leave, I would walk to the door and say goodbye to him and his dog. My mum was curious, and so she asked me to describe my imaginary friend. I told her the man's name and that he was fat and could be kind of mean sometimes, but that he was usually nice when we played. I also told her about dog and that it was very mean and I was never allowed to pet it, but I was glad to see it anyway. This all happened at about the same time every day, as if it were on a schedule. After a few months, my mum noticed that I had not been playing with my imaginary friend anymore, and wondered why. That's when I told her that he had told me that he couldn't come over anymore, that was the end for me, and I'd never mentioned him again. Soon after that, my mum had been talking to my grandma on my dad's side, and she told her about my imaginary friend. My mum said my grandma had become pale and looked extremely surprised. My grandma then pointed out to my mum that the description matched my grandma's father exactly. The truck, its colour, the appearance, the attitude, and the most surprising part was that his name matched, and the dog's name and description matched his favourite dog he had. My grandma doesn't believe in supernatural things, but she even thinks that there was something that came to visit me. And no matter if it was a ghost or an angel, it was her father. I'd never met this man in my life, as he had died many years before I was born. The dog he had, when he came to me, had died even further in the past. This first experience had made my father a bit nervous of me once he had heard about it. My second experience happened around the same time as the first, but I do not remember this one as well. Most of the story comes from what my parents have told me. My dad was home alone with me while my mother was at work. I had been sitting at the sliding glass door that led to our backyard for a long time, so my dad checked in on me, wondering what I was doing. I nonchalantly told him that there had been a woman standing in our yard for a long time. This of course made him nervous that someone had been trespassing and was watching me, so he came over to check. He obviously did not see anyone standing out there, but went outside to verify in case. When he returned, I yelled at him because I was getting mad that he could not see her just standing there not moving. I told him that I even watched him walk right in front of her when he went out. Becoming scared for and of what I was saying, he took me away from the window and wouldn't let me leave him until my mum got home from work. She asked me to explain what I had seen, and I tried to tell her the way the lady looked. I told her that it looked like a lady in one of your pictures, and also an angel statue we had in our house. She of course wanted to know which picture I was talking about, so I got her wedding photo album out from our bookshelf and pointed to a picture of her grandmother who lives in Germany. Again, like the last experience, I had never seen my mother's grandmother because she had died a long time before I was born. I'd never seen this lady again, but my family has always seriously believed I had seen an angel. I haven't told anyone outside the family and friends about these experiences, so I would love to hear what other people think. I can't for sure explain either of them, but I do believe they were supernatural. I'm also not sure whether or not they were both the same type of thing, or if they were different. Since then I haven't had any other experiences, but it has left me with a belief in the supernatural. It all started when my wife and I first visited her mother's new home. Her mother had remarried and lived in a decent-sized house out in Palm Desert. We would visit them when I had time off from work. I had taken a shower in the guest bathroom, and when I got out amongst the fogged-over mirror, there were 2 children's handprints. At first I thought it was a print from her 3-year-old sister Emily, and when I was done, we brought her in to see if she had done it. The prints were at least twice as big as hers, looking like they'd belonged to a kid of around 8. My father-in-law, after this incident, tells us that a little boy haunts the house as a joke. He says when his own sons were young, he saw a kid run in the kitchen while watching TV. Thinking it was his son, he got up and walked towards where the boy ran. When he opened his son's room, they were both asleep. Any kid can pretend to be asleep, which he didn't think much of. The next few times we come, Emily has started to talk about her imaginary friend, and we ask who it is, and she says the word ghost, which is something we've never talked about around her. We ask her where is the ghost, and she goes where her room is and points to the middle of the floor and proceeds to lay down like she's dead. We laugh nervously now, thinking there's an actual ghost there that's harmless, but it gets worse. Around February, I had to go away for work 2 to 3 weeks. My wife stayed over at her mum's house during my absence with our 2-month-old son David. She tells me that one night at 4 a.m. she's feeding David, and she starts to drift off to sleep. All of a sudden, the door in the bathroom starts creaking open, and she sees the arms of a little kid following it. The door closes, and she hears footsteps run and slam into another door. This can't be her Emily, because she's asleep with her mum. Now, it's June, and we come to pick up her sister for 2 weeks, and that night, as we're asleep, my wife had a very realistic dream. In her dream, we had gotten into a fight, and when I left, she was in a tub of water holding something down, like a child drowning. She says she prayed to the Archangel Michael for protection, but before it ended, she heard a very dark voice whisper in her ear, "You're doing great." 2 weeks later, we come back to drop off Emily, and she has a dream that night of a little kid whispering in her ear and laughing. Her mum then tells us a month before she was sleeping and had heard the same thing, except the child says "Billy, he's coming." Then she hears heavy footsteps down the hall and feels her legs go numb, followed by a heavy hit in her chest that blacks her out. I'm not sure what's going on in that house. I'm honestly scared for them and my child when I'm going over there. If anyone knows how I can ward this off, it would be greatly appreciated. This all started when I was about 12. My parents had just gotten divorced, and I was in a pretty bad place. I still had imaginary friends at that age, but I imagine it's because I didn't really have many real friends. Anyway, I remember one friend in particular whose name was Zach. Now, I met Zach when I was about 8, so you can imagine we'd been friends for quite a while. Since I had grown since I met Zach, I was starting to realize that something wasn't quite right about him. When I first met him, I saw he had a rope necklace around his neck. I didn't realize at my young age that it was a noose. The only reason I know it's a noose now is because I had met him by a tree as a child, where there is a rather large rope burned in one of the branches. Anyway, I started to realize that Zach wasn't the same as he had been when I first met him. He grew older like I did, which none of my other imaginary friends had done, and he was starting to act differently. Kind of like most teenagers do, except he'd make strange noises and try to tell me who to trust and be friends with. When I didn't listen to him, he'd get angry. Now that I've grown up, I realize Zach isn't human. But little 12-year-old me didn't know that. Little me thought that maybe he was just angry, and he was. One night I was staying over at my friend's house. We had been staying up all night and watched scary movies that neither of us should have been watching. After the movies, my friend wanted to go to sleep, and I was pretty tired, so we did. That was a bad idea. At around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of someone opening the bathroom door. At first, I thought it was her dad getting home to check on us, as he worked the night shift and usually arrived at around 3 a.m. But I was wrong. It was Zach. I saw him right there in front of me, solid. I remember he had really dark hair and green eyes, and so many freckles. I wasn't scared, but I was confused. I only ever saw Zach by the tree where we met. I don't remember anything after seeing him at first. All I remember is my friend's mum yelling at me to come inside from the pouring rain. I was soaked and scared, and I couldn't remember why I was outside or how I got there. I just remember telling her that Zach wanted to play with me. I didn't see much of Zach after that. Maybe it's because I had told him to go away, and that he had got me in trouble. Well, I didn't see him until recently. I'm 23 now, and a caregiver for elderly and special needs patients. Needless to say, I'm well past the age when I should have an imaginary friend. The other night, I was caring for a client who lives in a pretty secluded area, which normally doesn't bother me, except it was getting dark fast, and I'm not a fan of the dark. I hate driving in it and being stuck in it. I was making her dinner as we were talking about her favorite show, America's Got Talent. She stopped in the middle of speaking and looked at me and said, "I have to ask you if you don't mind, who is your handsome friend?" I wasn't sure who she was talking about, but I should note that this woman is sharp. She's got her wits about her and is smart. I turned and asked her what she was talking about, and she said, "The young man who came with you. Dark hair, pretty eyes. Says his name is Zach." I couldn't believe it. I thought Zach wasn't real. I was sure he wasn't. I didn't say anything to her, and just fed her before leaving. Today I was working with a special needs client who is nonverbal. He never says a thing. I took him out for ice cream and got him a bowl of chocolate, and myself mint chocolate chip. I asked him if he liked his ice cream, only expecting a nod. I got more than I bargained for. He looked at me and smiled and said, "You know that chocolate is my favorite, Cassie." My nickname is Cassie, but none of my clients know that. If they call me by my legal name, it's Sam, but this client has never called me anything because he can't talk. I think it's very clear that Zach is back in my life, and he's not going anywhere. But I have to wonder if Zach is a ghost or something much darker. When I was younger, I lived in this house in the middle of nowhere. It was very close to a cemetery. When we first moved in, I was 4, and we later moved out when I was 6. We ended up moving back in the same house when I was 8. I had 2 imaginary friends. They were the ages of 12. Their names were Ashley and Alyssa. I remember them so clearly. I even remember them helping me clean my room and keeping me company when I was alone. I thought it was odd how my parents could never see them, but they would laugh at me when I brought them up. I never counted them as imaginary. I did have an actual imaginary friend, who I called Sarah, but I never saw her and I knew I created her, so I knew the difference between imaginary and non-imaginary. I would always have dreams of Ashley and Alyssa basically every night, and there was one dream in particular that I remember very clearly. I had this dream a couple of nights before my family and I moved out. It was also the last dream I had with them both. What was so weird about the dream was that the room was identical to the one I had when I moved back into the house. I had a different style bed. I had carpets this time, and my room was blue, not pink. In the dream, Ashley, Alyssa, and I were on the bed. We were just talking. Then out of nowhere, they started laughing and pointed at the ground by my door. I looked at where they were pointing, and there were hundreds and hundreds of these small devils. They were the ones that you wind up. They all had odd-shaped keys in the back of them that you inserted and twisted for them to move. In my dream, I got up out of curiosity to see what they were. They started chasing me through my home, and I remember I woke up running, still being able to see them behind me. They disappeared once my dad ran into me, asking me what was wrong. As years passed, I forgot about the dream, and once I moved out, I never had a dream of Ashley and Alyssa and haven't seen them since. We ended up moving back in about 2 years later. I was older now, and I changed my room and the furniture I had in it, exactly like in the dream. I never really had anything creepy happen in the house, but when my family and I moved back in, odd things would happen. Lights would flicker, only in my room. Things would fall off shelves, pictures on my wall would just fall off my wall, and I would hear knocking coming from one of my closets. My television would shut off, and I would see things in the corner of my eyes. One day, I was cleaning my room. I noticed that by my closet, the one I would hear knocking in, there was a piece of wood on the frame popping out. I went on the ground and removed it, and I noticed that there was some kind of small hole just big enough to fit my finger through. That was on my wall, hidden behind the wooden frame. I go and look to see if there's anything there. I reach in with my finger, and I felt something. So I slide it out, and there was an old key. Not any kind of old key though, but the one specifically for the wind-up devils I had in the dream. I had completely forgotten about the dream up until this point, so it didn't really strike me as creepy or anything. A couple of nights passed since I found the key, and odd stuff started to happen. It was so bad that I didn't want to be in a room by myself. I knew there was someone with me. My door wouldn't open and slam shut. My lights would rapidly go on and off, and I would hear footsteps by my bed. All sorts of unexplained stuff was happening. One night, before bed, it hit me. The odd-shaped key was from my dream, and then I realized that my room was decorated the same way as in my dream. Everything suddenly made sense. There's been conspiracies that spirits can change their appearance, and also another saying that spirits are attracted to young children because of how much energy they have. What if they were people who died and were buried in the cemetery by my home, and they were changing their appearance so I wouldn't find them as scary, since, to me, they looked like kids too. Maybe this is just an odd coincidence, and all the other unexplained things are related to the fact that I lived very close to the cemetery. But I thought I would share it with you all, because still years later, I think about my imaginary friends and that strange house, and I can't quite wrap my head around it. When I was a little girl, I tended to move around a lot, ever since I can remember. Since my parents worked at about 1 or 2 jobs at once. But one thing remained consistent. It was innocent enough for a child around my age. Roughly from 3 to 7, due to me moving around often, I never had any real friends for very long. So I made imaginary friends. I often wondered why at times, even though they would leave me from time to time, only to keep me up at night and getting me into trouble with my less than kind father. Though as I grew older, he got better at controlling his tempers. But then he had a hard time with that, which made me terrified to do anything around him. So I locked myself in my room whenever I wanted to play. You know, typical girl things: dress ups, dolls, puzzles, drawing, trying to sing like a Disney princess, and trying way too hard to hold out notes that put too much strain on your vocal cords. My imaginary friend, Lou, was never angry at me. In fact, Lou gave me confidence and bravery, and happiness was abundant. I called it Lou because, thinking back on it, Lou fitted feminine features whenever we played and had fun. But when my father was around, Lou became masculine and protective, though Lou consciously somehow knew it couldn't do anything physical to protect me from my father's random fits of anger and blind rage. Lou would simply go to another friend's house after my father's fists, but guaranteed Lou would return to me. So me being innocent and wanting to see my only friend, I waited for Lou, even sometimes pulled all-nighters just to be sure that she came home safely. One night, while pulling an all-nighter, my mum woke up for a midnight snack. She noticed my bedroom light was still on and came in assuming I'd had a nightmare. When she came into my room, she saw that I was picking up toys and picking out specific ones I had yet to play with along with Lou. "Honey, what are you doing? It's really late," my mother said. "But Mama, I'm waiting for my friend," I said, treating it as an everyday thing. But that only caught her off guard and gave me a questioning look, so I just continued. Lou said that she was going to her friend's house and will be back, like she always does when Daddy becomes angry. My mother was awestruck. Her baby girl was talking about an imaginary friend who would leave and come back, and chalked it up to an extreme imagination, but knew it was too good to be true, and looked around to the room. Our home at the time was a rather old trailer in a cul-de-sac, and it was previously owned by a family of 3 women who were self-proclaimed Wiccans and enchanted the home with protective spells. Once my mother's search was complete and unfruitful, she let out a sigh and let it be. Some words about Lou. I'm 18 and still live with my mum and sister. My father has moved out but visits every now and then, and so does Lou. I mentioned how Lou always went away after my dad had his hissy fits, but what followed him was misfortune. Whether it be getting fired or caught cheating on my mother, it was always something, which I noticed as I reached middle school and a bit into high school. All I know is that even now that I moved into a totally different house that isn't a trailer, Lou still protects me and keeps in touch with my dreams. However, new house, new issues, and I've been seeing Lou as more masculine than ever and more protective, even without my father around. Why is she like this? What's out to get me? I don't know, but it's not good. I've seen figures, apparitions, heard voices, and been physically attacked. I feel like I'm a target. But of what? I hope Lou will help me get the answers soon. When I was very young, between the ages of 3 and 4, I had an imaginary friend. It was an older woman who wore a babushka. I would often describe her to my family as the witch from Snow White. As a child, that character would terrify me to the point that I couldn't look on screen whenever she was on. As a child, we had a playroom of sorts in the back of the house. The room had a sliding back door which led out onto the deck. I would often see her walking up my deck steps towards this room and be terrified. However, once she got to the door and entered the playroom, I'd no longer be afraid. Even though she was ugly looking and resembled a character I feared, I felt kindness and sincerity from her. She would play games with me, as I was a very lonely kid, specifically Connect 4. I became quite used to her presence. I would see her walking through my yard from other windows in the house and excitedly run to the playroom to meet her. I had no fear of her, and she always would just come inside and play with me for a bit before disappearing. I would talk to my family about my friend, and they would tease me, assuring me it was just my imagination. This went on for maybe a year, until I just stopped seeing her. For a few years following, my family would occasionally bring it up and tease me, but eventually we all kind of forgot about it. Fast forward to my high school days. Now, to understand the story better, let me describe the layout of the house. My living room has a sofa against one wall, and against another wall an oversized chair-type sofa with an ottoman. Whenever I had sleepovers with a friend, one of us would sleep in the sofa and the other on the big chair/ottoman. From the chair you could see the sliding back door that I mentioned previously. The old playroom was now converted into a dining room, and I was sleeping on the chair and my friend Krista on the couch. It was your typical teenage night. We had wine coolers, or two, maybe smoked some green stuff, and stayed up late watching TV. And this is where things get weird. The next day when we wake up, my friend Krista tells me about a weird dreaming/waking dream she'd had. She said that in this dream she woke up, but was laying on the big chair and not on the couch like in reality. So essentially we'd switched positions. She then looks over the back door and sees an old woman with a scarf wrapped around her head, looking through the glass at her. She then said she kind of knocked and waved at her, and my friend woke up. When my friend told me this dream in the morning, I immediately got a knot in my stomach. I had pretty much forgotten about my imaginary friend, and I had definitely never told her the story. It was so bizarre the way she described it, like how she switched sleeping spots and how she saw her through the door. I told my mum the story too, and she got silent and didn't really want to talk about it. She is a huge skeptic of the paranormal. As creepy as it is, I sort of feel like maybe this woman is somehow watching over me. Krista turned out to not be so good a friend, and as scary as this woman looked, she never seemed malevolent at all to me. Anyway, I just thought I'd share this story with you. Any thoughts on what this woman may be would certainly be appreciated. Growing up as a small child, there was this really sweet girl who would come over and play pretty much every day. She never really talked about herself or her family, and 5-year-old me didn't really care too much about it anyway. This girl was a very good friend, and she always had her cat with her. That was super friendly, and just like her. I remember it having the softest fur I have ever touched before or since. Well, we were friends for about 2 years before we had to move because my dad found a better job in another town far away from where we were living at the time. It was kind of heartbreaking to say goodbye to Precious, the girl, and I promised that I wouldn't forget her. Fast forward 10 years, and I'm having a conversation with my mum and make an offhand remark about Precious. What my mother told me was kind of scary, but at the same time kind of cool. Precious had been dead for about 30 to 50 years before I was even born. Even her pet cat was a ghost. Thinking back on it, her clothes were a bit odd and out of date. She wore a lot of those summer dresses that were really popular in the 30s and 40s, and she had a tendency to use phrases that I didn't quite understand, though she was more than happy to explain them. As an adult, it would have been pretty obvious that there was, at the very least, something very odd happening, but for a child, I didn't notice anything. When I was really young, under 8, we lived in an old hotel. The hotel had been built in the late 1980s. It was in a very small town next to railroad tracks. My sister was 1 year younger than me, and we shared the same room until we moved to another house and got separate rooms in 1980. We would both tell our parents about the various people we saw and talked to in our room. Typically, we only saw them at night. We also saw them in our dreams. The one I remember most was a soldier that had been blown apart. I don't know when he was a soldier from. He was scary at first, but he was more scared and confused than scary after a while. Both of us just accepted having them around. Our parents just blew it off as overactive imagination and having imaginary friends. Now you might be tempted to blow it off in the same regard. However, we have independent validation. A few years later, my aunt and cousin moved into the house. My sister and I never told my aunt or cousin about what we had seen. To us, it was perfectly normal. My parents had never told them either. My cousin spent one night in that room, and after that she would never go back in. My aunt started asking questions about ghosts, hauntings and the like. My parents brought up what we had said when we were younger, when we all got together and they asked my sister and I about it. We both were like, "Sure there are ghosts there, what's the big deal? We told you about this when we lived there." I don't remember many details of the individual ghosts at this point, but I remember the old-time clothing the most. Big billowy dresses, top hats and overalls. The soldier I remember being in the olive drab style clothing, and I seem to remember the legs being mangled and bloody. Perhaps part of his face too. Unfortunately, the building is now long gone, so no real follow-up is possible. But I wonder if other people grew up in a haunted house. This happened when I was really young. I think I was the age of 5 or 6 at the time. My mother was a very high-profile businesswoman and was opening a new office for her business in a different city. She wanted to spearhead the operation, and so the 3 of us moved very quickly. This was happening at the end of the school year, so when we arrived I had plenty of time to relax and get accustomed to the new house. The house was beautiful and very big, extremely spacious and quite old, and needed to undergo some work. My parents were thrilled, but always incredibly busy. My mother would stick to the back room and type away furiously on her computer, plowing paper after paper, having them being spit out the printer to be sent to the new office to prepare the teams. My father, as a freelance photographer, was sometimes here and sometimes not. It just really depended on the clients. There'd be a few hours where my parents might not be home and told me to never open the door and to stay home like a good girl, and other times when people would be over to look after me. Honestly, the time I'd be alone would be very rare and very short, and my parents made sure to lock every single door in the house and window so that I had no way of getting out and no way of letting anyone in during these periods. It was around this time that I got lonely, and I started conjuring up imaginary friends. Although as to the imaginariness of this friend is debatable. The friend I created was called Sally. She was a girl a bit taller than me. I estimate now that she must have been at least 9 or 10, as she was a fair bit taller than I was. She was always really sweet to me, and we would have fun playing games together. We loved playing Connect 4, Ring Around the Rosie, and all sorts of things, and just generally have a great time. So when my parents were busy, or when I was alone, I always had something to do. When I told my parents about her during breakfast, they just assumed that she was your standard imaginary friend, and kind of shrugged it off. Then one afternoon, as I was alone, we were playing a game, I can't remember what, and she beckons me to come down the stairs and that she has something to show me. That's when she takes me to the very bottom of the staircase, where we have a little cupboard. She tells me to open the door, and I look inside. There's just a whole load of junk, and I look around, and there's nothing really of interest that I can play with. She tells me to look at the end, and when I look further in, the door slams shut, and I can't open it. The light goes off too, and at this point I'm terrified. I go through the junk in the dark and start hammering my fists on the door, pleading, demanding to be let out. I start crying in the darkness, and after a while I start to get scared. What if there's something in there with me? I was so betrayed and upset. My friend had just literally thrown me into a dark closet and left me there. I was crying for what felt like hours, but honestly was no more than 25 minutes. My mum came home while on the phone, and I remember vividly screaming as I heard her phone conversation. The moment she said, "Hold on a sec," did I hear her running up to the cupboard and throwing the door open. I was crying, and I had actually wet myself in fear. She wondered what the hell was going on, and when I told her it was my imaginary friend, she gave me a blank stare, hung up on the phone, and went and got me changed, gave me a bath, and we had a little chat. She asked me to describe my imaginary friend with her, and I told her that she was this little girl who was a bit older than me, who had blonde hair down to her shoulders, and these really striking blue eyes, and was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. She gave me a quizzical look, and asked if the little girl had something on her face. I noticed now that she was trying to not ask a leading question, and I said that her face was littered with freckles and that she had a very strange cut around her chin. At that point, my mother went silent and asked me if I was sure. I said yes, and with my fingers showed her roughly how big it was on her chin, because it led all the way from her chin to roughly halfway up her jaw. Didn't look very nice. She just tried to calm me down and told me to forget about it and that everything was okay. I was never visited by her again, and I was glad to be. But many years later, when I was talking to my mother, did she bring up imaginary friends and asked if I remembered the one I'd had. I told her I did, and that I wasn't very happy and fond of her. She told me that she had something to tell me. The imaginary friend I had was actually my mother's younger sister. When my mother was quite young, her family died in a car accident. She was only about 7 at the time, so roughly the age I was when I started seeing the spirit. She was the only survivor of the crash and was raised by her grandparents. Her sister had had that same cut on her chin the day she died, because a few days before that, they had been playing in the garden and she cut herself with a piece of glass. My mother remembers her sister that way because that was the last way that she saw her, wearing jeans and a top. She was very freaked out that day she gave me the bath, and I was even more freaked out hearing it now. I don't know why she was mean to me, my auntie. Maybe she was jealous that my mum survived and she did not. Either way, I don't want to see my not-so-imaginary friend again. Throughout my life, I've had quite a few paranormal experiences. Call me weird, be skeptical, but I know what happened to me. I believe also that children are more susceptible to the paranormal because they don't know what they're supposed to block out. This one particular instance, I don't actually remember. I believe it's true because my mom, dad, and sister all maintain that this actually happened. My sister was the one who witnessed it. To begin, when I was a kid, we lived in the south side of Chicago. I was 4 years old when we moved, so this happened sometime between the ages of 3 and 4, because I was able to talk. I had 5 imaginary friends: Juan, Carlos, Carla, Jorge, and Amy. Yes, I had 4 Mexican imaginary friends, and 1 white one. I don't know why. Amy was always seen as my twin. You know, the one who did the bad things, and I would blame her. I only remember Amy. My mom, dad, and sister are always shocked when I reminded them that I don't remember the other 4 imaginary friends at all. They disappeared when we moved to North Carolina from Chicago, and Amy was the only one that stuck. My sister is also 7 years older than me. One day while we still lived in Chicago, I was playing in the living room in front of the TV, while my sister watched me and made sure I didn't do anything to get myself into trouble. All of a sudden I screamed and started crying out of nowhere. My sister freaked out and went into the kitchen as my mom was coming to see what was wrong. My sister goes, "I don't actually know, she just started crying." My mum comes over to me and asks what happened, and as plain as day I say, "Amy bit me." Being a 4-year-old, that wasn't too credible, and my mum tried to blame my sister when she did. I go, "No, it wasn't Amanda, it was Amy, she bit me." So humoring me, my mum asks me, "Okay, where did Amy bite you?" And I pointed to my back. My mum lifts up my shirt, and in the middle of my back is a clear bite mark. So I was in the car with my mum today, and she brought up this story. And at first she goes, "When did that happen?" And then she remembered all of a sudden that she got this look on her face that was a mix between uncomfortable and confused. She goes, "Yeah, I didn't tell you at the time, but I never had any doubt in my mind that your invisible friends weren't really invisible, that they were spirits. And I think the 4 Hispanic children were good spirits and that Amy was something else, which you decided to call Amy because you would always talk about her getting into trouble or doing bad things. You would always blame bad things on her. I think you may have been onto something when you said that the 4 others were trying to protect me from her." I was around 3 or 4 years old when I had my first imaginary friends. Though my personal memory of the experience is dappled by age, my parents reminded me of the incident consistently. Having what I believed to be an overactive imagination, I created not 1, but 2 imaginary friends for myself. It started on the way to the local supermarket, when I slid from the far right seat of the back row of the car to the middle seat. My mother asked me what's the matter. "I have 2 new friends, Mummy." "What are their names, son?" After a minute of staring out the window, I replied, "This one's Jack." I looked out the other window. This one's Mac. My mother was fascinated by my sudden interest with imaginary friends and asked me what they looked like. They're both really old, Mummy, and have really long beards. My father at this point, being a devout ZZ Top fan, began singing La Grange. My mother, on the other hand, continued asking me basic questions about the two recently acquired friends. For the next 3 months, I took Jack and Mac everywhere with me. We had frequented one restaurant to the point that when the server saw our family, she automatically provided 2 extra chairs and placement mats for my friend. They never ordered anything, of course. It was one day that we entered our favorite restaurant that things got a little strange. The waitress prepared the table for us, with the 2 extra placemats as she normally would. When I informed her that I didn't have my friends anymore, she went, "Sweetie, where are your friends?" "They went home." "To our house?" "No, Mummy, they went to the graveyard. That's where I got them from." Both my mum and dad went white-faced, and I never had an imaginary friend after that. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Huge thank you to all my patrons who you can see on screen now. If you too would like to become a patron and help with the running of this channel and everything that goes along with it, it would of course mean an awful lot to me, help me out a bunch. Of course it is entirely optional, link in the description. Now if you liked the video, because I did, why not drop a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe and press the bell icon if you're new here. So I made this video on imaginary friends, and I don't think any of them are actually imaginary, they're all just kind of spooky and paranormal. But there you go. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed it. So, what do you know? All the imaginary friends turned out to be dead. Isn't that just charming? If there's a story that you would like to share, don't forget to send it to my email or post it to my Reddit page. Either are fine, and it could feature on a video very soon. Just be sure to add plenty punctuation, paragraphing, and description in order for your story to potentially qualify. That'd be great. And yeah, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.